We're going to be in 1 Timothy again. The entire study is out of the book of 1 Timothy, so if you want to go ahead and start turning to 1 Timothy. We talked about chapter 1 last week. We're actually going to talk about chapter 3 this week. I'm skipping chapter 2 because chapter 3 has a very direct bearing as far as the lessons that I want to draw out on what we read and talked about in chapter 1 last week when we talked about the reality of false teachers. And so we're going to go to chapter 3. I didn't change the heading there. It should be 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through the end of the chapter, which will be about verse 16. We're going to talk about the need for leaders and the roles of church leaders today. The fact of the matter is, when you go back through and you read the Bible, you read the New Testament, it was a task of Timothy and Titus and some of the other folks who were working on the missionary journeys, if you will, working as basically evangelists and missionaries, to establish leadership in each of the congregations that they went to. Now, of course, here, as a congregation operating under the direction of just the men of the congregation, this is something that we need to keep in mind. This is something that we need to be working toward. And with as few folks as we have, and with as much as this congregation fluctuates, people coming and people going, this is tough to accomplish. But it is something that we definitely need to have in our minds as we move forward into the future of this congregation. We need to look at these roles. We need to understand the qualifications for these roles, and we need to start working toward this goal. I have no idea what kind of time frame we would be looking at. I have no idea who might fall into these roles, who might fit these roles. But this is something that we need to be able to do, and we need to be able to identify for the future of this congregation. So if you go ahead and you turn to 1 Timothy chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 1 here, but the board picks up at verse 2. It says, "The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task." One of the very first things that we see here is that this work is something that one should want to actually do. I've worked with a couple of elderships in the past. One of the elderships I worked with, there was one elder who was not, who didn't necessarily want the job. He was drafted into it. He was told, "Hey, we need another guy, and you're the guy." And he said, "I don't want to be the guy." And they said, "No, you're the guy." And he said, "I don't want to be the guy." And they said, "No, you're the guy." And he said, "Okay, I'll be the guy." He was never happy working in that position, and you could see it. And so we see one of the things that is required, I don't have too much more of a note on through the rest of the lesson, but an understanding of the gravity of the job, and yet a commitment to do the job, and not a selfish ambition, but a desire to help lead a congregation is something that's very important, it's very vital. But let's look at the qualifications here that Paul passes along to Timothy. Now, these qualifications are also reflected in the book of Titus. So if you want to go and read some more supplemental information, Titus chapter 1 is a great place to go. You'll read a little bit more on this, a little bit different take on a couple of the things, but still it's essentially the same qualification. So again, pretty consistent between the two writings from Paul, of course, to Timothy and then to Titus. Starting in verse 2, we see, "Therefore an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil." Now we see this role of an elder, a role of an overseer. You'll see this particular office called a couple of different things throughout the Scriptures. You'll see it called a bishop, not in the Catholic sense of what a bishop is, but again the New Testament sense here of a bishop, an overseer, an elder. A presbyter is used sometimes. A shepherd, again, is probably one of the more widely used ones. So we see this office is being described as one who oversees the workings of a congregation. And so this basically, this plurality of elders, this eldership, if you will, is the group of people, the group of men who are in charge of basically the operation of a congregation, not just in the fiscal sense or the physical sense, but also, and most importantly, in the spiritual sense. And so the spiritual purity of the role of an elder is something that one must definitely keep in mind. You notice that there's no prerequisite that someone be a professional, that someone have an advanced degree, that someone be a successful businessman. Those kinds of things aren't in there because those are earthly focused things. The things that are in this list, and we're going to expand some more upon them in just a little bit, the things in this list talk about the spiritual maturity of the individual who is serving in that capacity. They talk about the respectability of that person, the responsibility, the level of responsibility that individual can handle, the track record that individual can handle. And so again, we're going to talk some more about these a little bit later on. But not only does Paul tell Timothy about the office of elder, he also talks about the office and the qualifications for ones who would serve as a deacon. Looking at verse 8 and following, a deacon likewise must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must hold the mystery of the faith with a clear conscience. And let them also be tested first. Let them serve, then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. The wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. Now, the idea here in both cases of the husband of one wife is the idea of a man being a one-woman man. Polygamy was something that was well known. Adultery was something that was well known. Promiscuity was commonplace in the ancient Mediterranean society. And so this idea of fidelity to family, fidelity to a wife, was something that was very important. The idea of managing a household well, managing children well, was also something that was extraordinarily important. So we see this in both offices. The biggest difference between a deacon and an elder is the fact that an elder oversees the entire congregation, whereas a deacon might oversee one particular aspect or one particular work. And so a deacon was someone who was considered a worker or a fellow worker amongst the members of the congregation. And so this office here was the idea of someone being assigned to taking care of a very specific task within a congregation. If you go to some of the other religious groups, you will see that there is one person who's sometimes called a bishop, or one person sometimes called a pastor, who kind of runs everything, or you may have a board of deacons who run everything under the oversight of one pastor or one minister. You'll have congregations where you'll have what's commonly referred to as ministerial oversight. That's where basically the preacher is in charge. I don't like that idea. I don't want to be in charge of nothing. But we see the idea of leadership, the offices of leadership, are oftentimes misplaced, they're misunderstood, and they're misused, and people who end up in these positions of leadership oftentimes abuse the leadership role. And so that's why you see anytime you talk about elders, there's always used in the plural, unless one person is referring to himself. Peter refers to himself as a fellow elder. That's one of the few times where it's not used in the plural. You see deacons who were established or set up and ordained, if you will, to borrow a term, to take on a particular task. You see the 7 deacons, basically, who were chosen early in the work of the church to feed the Greek-speaking widows who weren't being taken care of. Peter and John and James and those guys said they needed to be about ministering to the Word and in prayer, and they set up these 7 guys who are well thought of, who basically met these qualifications to go about doing that task. And so we see here the delegation of responsibilities amongst the leaders and among the workers of the congregation. And so this is how a congregation should be set up. This is how a congregation should be established. And so once you really take a look at this, you see how brilliant the idea is to have a multiple number of people who are in leadership positions so that the responsibilities are diffused and so they can balance out each other. These are all very, very important things for us to look at and for us to keep in mind when we think about these offices of leadership. Now, Again, there was a fellow by the name of F. LaGard Smith who wrote a book on elders and leaders in a congregation at one point in time, and the title of the book was called "They Smell Like Sheep." And you'd think that was a pretty good title, because what it means is that the leaders of a congregation must be amongst the members of the flock. And so all of these things are very important for us to recognize and for us to remember when we're thinking about the offices of both elders and deacons. And so there are some very, very important aspects of this leadership type, of what is going on in a congregation here. And there's a very important background behind why Timothy was told to do what Timothy was told, and the way Timothy was told to do it here by Paul. Now, you have to remember that Paul was writing to Timothy, and Timothy was in Ephesus at this point in time. And you go back and you read the book of Ephesians, you will get a better picture of what Timothy was dealing with, even though 1 Timothy was written a little bit later than the book of Ephesus was. You can kind of see why Timothy was told the things he was told in this particular book. But we also see specific reasons why this leadership was put in place and what the purpose behind the leadership that was put in place. And so when we look at the churches, the church or churches, it's supposed that there were multiple congregations around the area of Ephesus. That's why there aren't a lot of very, very specific personal instructions given in the book of Ephesians. But we see the church or churches of Ephesus were faced with overcoming issues of a pagan system of worship. Remember, the temple of Diana, Diana of the Ephesians is great, the crowd chanted as they tried to lynch Paul. They had to overcome this. There were a lot of troubles, there were a lot of problems with this old pagan system of worship to Diana, and the economy, believe it or not, the economy of Ephesus was built around that temple, because not only was the temple a place of worship, the temple was probably the best bank in Asia Minor at that point in time. So this was a big deal. And so Paul wanted the people in Ephesus to overcome this pagan system of worship. There were a lot of other problems to deal with regarding that. Again, go to the book of Ephesians and read that, and you'll see a lot of the spiritual challenges that the people had to overcome. And so there were a lot of headwinds that the church was facing there at this point in time. And Paul had already run into people that were very arrogant, and they were promoting a lot of false doctrine. Remember the troubles that Paul ran into. Remember the fact that when he went back through Miletus on his way to Jerusalem to try to get there before Passover, Paul met with the elders of Ephesus there at Miletus, and he warned them about the trouble that was going to come. The wolves were going to come from within the congregation, within their own flock, and they were going to try to scatter the sheep. And so Paul is already trying to prepare them to deal with false doctrine. He's trying to get them to deal with all of the myths and all of the other things that we talked about last week when we talked about the reality of false teachers. People trying to pull them back to the law, people trying to get them to rely on genealogies and mystical thinking and things along those lines. And so Paul was already dealing with those things, and he was passing along this information to Timothy so he could deal with these things. We see Hymenaeus and Alexander were among the ringleaders, those specific false teachers who were teaching specific false doctrines, who were causing very specific problems that we talked about last week, hence the reason this lesson came immediately after chapter 1. So we already see these problems that were being prompted there, and Paul knew that strong and faithful leadership needed to be put in place. So if you don't have strong and faithful leadership, and these challenges of false teachings come, what's going to happen to the congregation? What's going to happen when there isn't a strong leadership in place from amongst the members of the congregation? When these false teachings come, how is a congregation going to stand up against them? How is a congregation going to be able to resist this false teaching? Well, the answer is they might not. It's vital that we understand that there has to be strong leadership put in place so when these things come along, folks aren't swept up in them. And people look to leadership so they can know and understand and trust the guidance of that leadership. We have a congregation just to the south of us here. And the leaders are not holding fast to sound doctrine. And when the leaders don't hold fast to sound doctrine, even those Christians who are strong and secure in their faith, they go along with it. We see it all the time. And so we can understand why Paul would tell Timothy to make sure these good men, very good men, are put in place to oversee this congregation so they aren't swept up in this false teaching and these false doctrines. And it could be anything that comes along and starts to pull people away from the gospel. Now, there are people who are still responsible for their own actions and they're still going to do what they want to do, but it should be, if they're going to do it, it should be in rebellion to good leadership and not because of good leadership. So we see that there were a lot of problems already facing that congregation in Ephesus. And so there are also purposes behind this list that we see, and we oftentimes look at this as kind of a checklist, right? We got this one, we got this one, we got this one. I've known of a congregation one time, as soon as a guy gets married, he's on the short list for deacons, and the second he has a kid, boy, he's a deacon, ready to go. That's not how that works. Like the lady in the insurance commercial, that's not how any of this works, right? So there's a purpose behind this list of characteristics that we should have. But the first thing that we see here is that this is not a job description. This is not a checklist. This is not something that we should go down through and have the clipboard and start marking these things off as people hit them. This is a portrait of those who are to lead. If you look at it like that, this is a portrait. This is what this person should look like. If we start looking at a checklist, if we start looking at the thou shalt and thou shalt nots, what happens? It becomes a legalistic list that we can find loopholes in, and then all of a sudden we have unqualified people sitting in a job that is so important that we can't overestimate. But this is what this person is supposed to look like. They may fit the checklist, but do they fit the image? Do they fit the picture? Do they fit in where they're supposed to be? Is this what this person looks like? Or are we looking off of a dry checklist? Well, the purpose is to make sure that this person matches the description, not of the job, but of the person that's supposed to be in that office. We also see here that Paul wanted to ensure that those who served in the office of overseer or eldership had specific qualities, not a padded resume. This is extremely important because the last thing that you want to do is to promote somebody to the office of elder or overseer who's not qualified, who doesn't desire the office, who doesn't hold fast to the gospel of Christ. Because the second that happens, you will start to see the leadership of a congregation erode. You will start to see the faithfulness of that congregation erode. You will start to see the spiritual maturity of the members of that congregation erode. And it may take time, and it may be subtle, but it will in fact happen. It's like the old saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And if the weakest link is the one who's in charge, that chain is going to break sooner rather than later. So we have to make sure that those who are appointed to that office have those specific qualities, and again, not a padded resume. And this passage is not just a manual for church organization. It is that, don't get me wrong. That's not all it is. But this is an effort to guarantee good leadership for the future. If we know this is what a leader looks like, we are going to be looking for that leader. And if we know that this is what a good leader looks like, we may try ourselves, we should try ourselves to match that image. This is not just a good image for someone who wants to be an elder, by the way, is it? This is a good image. This is a good understanding of what any Christian should look like. This is what every Christian should look like. And so this is an idea of attaining good leaders for the future. We also see that the leaders in this congregation are to have gained the respect of the people. Paul gives a prohibition against a new convert becoming an elder, lest he be puffed up. You baptized into Christ and you need to be an elder. There's something wrong with that. You just move into a congregation. You've been elsewhere for 15 years. You show up at a congregation. Maybe you were an elder at a previous congregation. Well, you're ready to be an elder here. I don't think so. I don't know the congregation. I don't love these people like I loved my last congregation. I don't know what's going on in this congregation. I don't understand who's who and what's what, and you don't know him either. Just like that book, Smell Like Sheep, that means you've been in the flock. Respect is something that is gained in order to be in that office. And the office doesn't grant respect. The person gains respect before being appointed to the office. Oh, I'm an elder now, you have to respect me. If I didn't respect you before, I'm not going to respect you now. If you didn't meet these qualifications before, what makes me think now that you're an elder you're going to meet these qualifications? If you weren't obeying the gospel of Christ before, what makes me think now that you are an elder, you're going to do it? If you weren't working for the Lord before, what makes me think you're going to work now that you're a deacon? Oh, I've seen that happen too many times too. Well, you know, so-and-so doesn't come to church a lot, so let's make him a deacon and maybe he'll come more. Ever seen that happen? How well did that work out? Never does. You end up with a person who doesn't come to church and a work that doesn't get done. This is something that has to happen in that order. If you're not here, if you're not respectable, if you're not showing your love for the gospel, if you're not doing those things before you're appointed to that office, you're not going to do it after. And then we end up losing an opportunity at that point. Elders also should have the respect of those outside of the church. Even the pagans had good qualities they looked for in leadership. Now, that doesn't mean we go by a worldly list of who should be leading. That's not what we're talking about here. Paul is not making accommodation for someone out of Ephesus who ran the finance system of the Temple of Diana, who became a Christian yesterday and ready to throw them in the office of eldership because people outside the church liked him. That's not what we're talking about. But we're talking about someone who is known in the community, someone who is respected by the community, someone who does not have a lifestyle that brings them into question by the members of the community. Most of y'all know who Mahatma Gandhi is, right? Gandhi, Indian independence. He's quoted as saying one time, "I really like your Christ, but I'm not sure I like Christians." That's what we have to avoid. If we are going to have someone lead the congregation, they need to be known and respected outside of the congregation as well. Because not only are elders leaders of a congregation, not only are deacons perceived as leaders of a congregation, but they are also an ambassador of Christ outside of the congregation. And just like the rest of us, if we don't have a good reputation, then we will not further the message of Christ. And just like Peter said, if they're going to accuse you of being a bad person, make sure that they have to lie in order to do it. We also see that these characteristics reveal something about those who are in this capacity. They reveal the traits that we are to look for. They reveal the brush strokes, if you will, and the portrait that we're looking for in those who would lead. They could be divided into 4 categories, if you will. One is obedience and observable behavior, verses 2 and 3. Leadership within one's own family, verse 4 and 5. Experience as a Christian, verse 6. And respect from outside, in verse 7. Think about what each one of these things mean. First of all, obedience and observable behavior. Do you look like a Christian from the outside? Can I look at you and say, this person reflects Christ? They're doing what Christ wants them to do. They're doing what Christ would have done. Now, do we expect it to be perfect? Well, of course not. But those who would be in a position of leadership, those who would teach, those who would serve, have to be more accountable to their faith. Leadership within his own family. How can one run the church if one cannot operate his or his own household? One must be able to show that they are able to manage their own household, that they're able to make the tough decisions, they're able to educate, they're able to discipline, they're able to do all of those things if they are to be a leader in the congregation. Now we're not just talking about a group of maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 people. We're talking about a group of dozens or even hundreds. And if we can't take care of a few, how can we take care of the many? Experience as a Christian. Now, I don't know if there is a specific time frame that Paul put in mind. But I can tell you, it's obvious when one's a mature Christian and one's not. Paul says, not a novice, not a rookie, is the best way, I guess, to paraphrase that. One who's had some experience, one who's had some time dealing with things as a Christian. Before one can deal with things as a leader of Christians, one must be able to deal with things as a Christian. Don't make a new Christian an elder, because then he may get puffed up. He may think, well, I know everything I need to know. I'm good to go. He's got to have some experience teaching as well. He's got to be able to pass along the gospel message of Christ. Does that mean one has to stand up here in front of the congregation on a Sunday morning or on a Wednesday night and deliver a lesson? That's part of it. But one must be able to relay to another person the gospel of Christ. And again, we talked about this idea of respect from the outside. One's not going to respect the leader of a congregation if they're not respected in the community. They should also show one's godliness, desire for unity, inner control, self-control, and commitment to Christ. By the way, do you know what the number one predictor of personal success in the world is? Self-control. It's not wealth, it's not intelligence, it's not any of those things. It's self-control. And that is to be reflected in the leaders of a congregation and in the members of a congregation. But look at these other things here. Godliness, my desire to be like God. Unity, my desire for us to be of one mind in Christ. That self-control we talked about, and then my commitment to Christ. What is my ultimate goal? As a leader of a congregation, it must be the furtherance of the gospel of Christ. We also see here that there are some results that come from these traits. There are some things that come about when one operates like this. First of all, we see effective leadership. Paul says it is worthy of double honor in chapter 5, verse 17. Double honor. You're doing good as a Christian, and we respect you for that. You're doing good as a leader, we respect you even more. Just the same on the opposite side. Those who would teach, those who would lead are held to a greater accountability and would receive a greater condemnation if they don't follow as they should. There is a reward for those who faithfully serve as deacons, chapter 3, verse 13. We see here that this honor and this greater reward is there for those who would continue to serve and to seek to serve Christ. And we will all know how to behave as a church. Look at verses 13 through 15, or through 16. For those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves, and also great confidence in the faith that is in Christ Jesus. That's that reward that we're talking about here. I hope I may come to you soon, but I am writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated by the Spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, and taken up in glory. we will all know how to behave in the church that belongs to God. How? By looking to those who lead us. Paul, as an apostle, of course, was a leader in the church. And even when he's dealing with the Corinthians in chapter 11, verse 1 of 1 Corinthians, he said, imitate me. Now, Paul didn't say, imitate me because I'm such a great guy, did he? Paul said, imitate me even as I also imitate Christ. Look to me to see who I'm following, and then follow Him. How will we know what we need to do? Well, the answer is simple. Those who are leading us will show us the way. And we also see that God's glory will be manifest in us. When people look to us, they should see God's glory reflected. When people look to us, they should know and they should understand who we follow and why we follow Him. And the lessons we should learn, finally. And this is not a Paul finally. I'm not just halfway done. We should all strive to have these traits. Every one of us. We look at those traits and we say, oh, that's great for someone who wants to be an elder. That's fantastic. Do it too. Look at those traits. Emulate those traits. Come to know what they mean and begin to reflect them in your life. Try to make your life match that portrait that Paul paints for leaders here. Because remember, one of the things he requires is godliness. And that's something that we should all strive to do. Reflect godliness in our lives. Because they represent mature Christianity. That's something that we all need to do. They serve to show the gospel to all mankind. We are to reflect that message in our everyday life. There was an early church father, a guy by the name of Origen, and he said, 200-ish A.D., he said, preach Christ always, use words when necessary. I think that was quoted a little bit later on by a guy named Charles Spurgeon, repeated by him. And it's a fantastic quote. It's a fantastic thought. Preach Christ always in everything that you do. And stay close to Christ. When we strive to do all of these things, when we strive to add all of these things to our lives, just like what Peter told us to add to our faith, godliness to our godliness, all knowledge, all of these things that we should add to our lives, if we have them and we're continually abounding in them, we will neither fall nor will we be unfruitful in our service to God. Strive to be close to Christ. We're looking for future leaders, aren't we? Not only should we strive to instill these traits in ourselves, but we should also seek to instill these traits in our children. When we teach them the songs in nursery school and Bible class, what's our end goal? Is it to have them be ready to recite the books of the Bible and get a certificate? I think that's a great thing. Don't get me wrong. That's a great thing to do. It's wonderful for the kids to know those things. But are we looking for these young men and these young women to grow up to be the teachers and the leaders of a congregation? Do we want these young men to grow up to be the elders and the deacons that the church so desperately needs? Do we want the young ladies to grow up to be the women and the wives and the mothers that this congregation needs, and the Bible class teachers that this congregation needs to help continue to grow? We had a couple of folks mention, and for our prayer requests the last couple of weeks, that we need to pray for the growth of this congregation. We need to pray for the children of this congregation. And this is one of the things that we do. We pray, but we work toward this as well. Because they are the church of tomorrow and the church of today. Somebody fussed at me one time. This was a while back. I said, the children are the church of tomorrow, and they looked at me and they said, well, what are they doing today? You're right. They are the church of tomorrow and the church of today. Let us all seek to add these things to our lives. Let us all seek to be the image that Paul represents in this passage. Let us all be ready to hold fast to the gospel message of Christ. And let us all be fruitful in our work for the Lord. The lesson is yours this morning. If you're here today and you are not yet a child of God, if you do not yet match the image that Christ would have us match, if you are not yet on that road to that home in heaven, I would ask you to consider the gospel message today. If you're here this morning and you need to be baptized in order to have your sins washed away, we stand ready to assist you in any way that we can. If you are a child of God, but you find that sin has separated you from your Heavenly Father and you need to repent of that sin and be restored back to your place in His kingdom, you can do that today as well. So if you're here this morning and you have any spiritual need, won't you come meet me up front as together we stand and sing this invitation song.